Happy Saturday. It is August 17th, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And Michael, it has been yet another wacky and unpredictable week in the news. In the U.S., the Democrats are having a moment. The latest polls show Kamala Harris taking a comfortable lead in key swing states, including Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Meanwhile, Nimat Shafik, the president of Columbia University, has resigned after months of turmoil surrounding, among other matters, her handling of pro-Palestinian protests on campus. Meanwhile, in Gaza, senior American officials have suggested that the Israeli military may have reached the end of the line when it comes to weakening Hamas, warning that they may never be able to fully eliminate the group. Also, everywhere else, we miss the Olympics. But as usual, Airmail and Morning Meeting are the antidote to all of the dramas of the news.
Absolutely, and we've got a great show for you today. First, it's August, and across America, students will soon be returning to college campuses, which were settings for so much divisiveness earlier this year. And this week, David Kaufman joins us with a fascinating story about how, at a time of growing discord between Jewish Americans and Black Americans, an often overlooked chapter in the history of America's historically Black colleges and universities provides a model for renewed cooperation between these once heavily allied groups. Then, followers of the Mormon religion have always been the largest group in Salt Lake City, Utah. For more than a century, it's been a religion that has kept its traditions to itself, however. But, as Samantha Leach will tell us, the television show Real Housewives of Salt Lake City is leading more than a few to choose pomp over piety. And finally, Carrie Monahan will join us from East Hampton, New York, with her fascinating story about a reclusive old man who lived in a dilapidated mansion on one of the town's most exclusive streets, and what happened to his property after he died this year. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
David Kaufman is here to remind us of an important chapter in the life and times of America's historically Black colleges and universities. David is an editor and columnist at the New York Post, a regular opinion writer for The Telegraph, as well as an adjunct fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute. Welcome, David.
Good morning.
You've uncovered and reported on such a fascinating element of the history of these historically Black colleges and universities. But before we get into that, why are they getting so much attention in the press lately?
I think in post-Black Lives Matter era, the post-George Floyd era, there was a lot of emphasis on how corporations and philanthropies could support traditionally Black and African-American institutions. And there's really no more traditional Black and African-American institution than HBCUs. For example, my grandparents met at one, many, many years ago. In supporting these institutions, you're really supporting the future of Black scholars, Black youth, and Black wealth building. And there's interesting data around the fact that students who matriculate into HBCUs generally tend to have a higher graduation rate, so they're more successful at HBCUs, and they're particularly successful in fields like the STEM fields, like this sort of the science and technology. Students who study STEM courses in Black colleges tend to have a higher graduation rate and go into higher paying jobs. In that context, we're seeing folks like Michael Bloomberg. His philanthropy recently gave $600 million to 4 HBCU medical schools, including Howard. And that followed on a $100 million donation a couple years back. And then we've seen similar 9-figure donations to Spelman, which is in Atlanta and sort of the most famous women's HBCU. The United Negro College Fund also received a very large donation recently, also 9 figures. So there's a lot of money given to HBCUs, and also HBCUs are a way, I think, for folks to really directly contribute towards the future of Black America.
So in your story, you remind us of an element of the history of these institutions and their relationship with Jewish professors. Can you explain a little bit about what was going on at that time?
Many, many Jewish, European, mostly German scholars found themselves expelled from Europe in the wake of the rise of Nazism and anti-Semitism. The most famous of these scholars were able to settle into America and to establish Ivy League schools. Many, many of the lesser known, but equally important and equally esteemed scholars and professors, Jewish, European scholars and professors, could not find their way into America's elite institutions. And so they risked extermination. The U.S. puts very onerous regulations upon Jewish professors trying to come into the U.S. They had to prove that they had a job. They had to prove that they could support themselves. And this was very hard because Nazi Germany didn't allow them to take their assets with them. In the context of this, or in the wake of this, many African-American institutions, HBCUs, put out a call for these scholars to come teach there. So schools like Howard, for instance, or Tougaloo, or Voorhees University, all of these institutions throughout the South, they basically put out a call for Jewish professors, if they couldn't find their way into sort of the Ivies or the traditional elite institutions, that they were welcome in African-American HBCUs. And about 50 of them actually came.
And David, how do you think that this particular period at these universities has influenced the trajectory of these universities going forward? Like, what have been the long-term effects of all that?
So it really made a long-term impact on the students. So folks like Jocelyn Elders, she studied in a university, in an HBCU that had Jewish professors. There's a notable sociology professor, Donald Cuddigan, who was a sociology professor at the University of Rhode Island. And he was, the third African-American to graduate from Harvard. He credits this time under Ernst Berinsky with really kind of influencing him and pushing him forward. And he talks about what it was like to have this sort of esteemed European professor like Berinsky, who demanded that his students stand up when he came into class and stand up when he left class, and the impact on him and this kind of formality. But these professors were also strong advocates for civil rights. I mean, they recognized that they were coming from a system of oppression in Nazi Germany, and suddenly they were in Jim Crow America and saw a similar form of oppression on these Black students. So Professor Berinsky, for instance, he was famed for, forcibly integrating some of his lectures for the public at a time when integration was not allowed, or he sent lesson plans and books to his students who were on the front lines of the civil rights movement, who were arrested, to make sure that they could keep up with their studies. So on the long term, these schools, some of them have done well, some of them haven't, but it really made an impact on the students.
But David, despite all of this, support for Israel at these HBCUs is quite low. How do you explain exactly what's going on there now?
So I think what's interesting is that HBCUs actually haven't had a lot of protests when it comes to pro-Palestinian issues. I think that's because of a lot of reasons. Students who come to HBCUs tend to be more traditional, tend to be less economically prosperous, and really need their education to move forward. There's a level of deep, deep respect and tradition in going to an HBCU. So it's just not really necessarily a place of protest. It's more a place of excellence and education building and thinking of the future. I mean, I wrote an article for The Spectator a couple of weeks ago where I basically said the reason why there are no protests at HBCUs for pro-Palestinian protests is that there's just also very few Jews there. And these protests against Israel and for the Palestinian cause tend to happen mostly where there are lots of Jewish students, and there just aren't at HBCUs. I think the issue is more, how does this play into the larger context and structure right now of the pro-Palestinian movement? I mean, so much of this movement has been led by young Black students and young African Americans. Blacks have amongst the most disfavorable opinions of Israel right now, even though that might not necessarily be reflective of the larger Black community. But younger Black people do have amongst the least favorable opinions of Israel right now. And so I think what this does is it kind of, there's this slice of history which has been somewhat forgotten. It does remind people that there is and there was this very strong tradition of allyship and camaraderie amongst African Americans and Black Americans. And most importantly, this tradition was a two-way street. This was not about Jews just giving philanthropy to Black people or just demonstrating altruism towards Black people, which oftentimes the legacy of Blacks and Jews is framed in what Jews have done for Blacks. This is really about African-American institutions opening the doors to Jewish scholars. And so not only do we welcome you, but we understand that we are providing you a lifeline. And yes, we're getting world-class educators in the process, but we are really, really, helping to save these people's lives. So I think it's also a moment for African Americans and young Black people to take pride in our history as well and our contribution to Jewish history in America.
It's an incredible story. So thank you so much for bringing it to our attention.
Thank you so much, David.
I was thrilled to work on this. Thank you, guys.
In less heady news, let's go over to the Hamptons, Michael. We've got Carrie Monahan, who's, I don't want to say our official Hamptons correspondent, but she's one of them. She's a Brooklyn-based writer and producer. She has discovered a rather Grey Gardens-esque story that has unfurled on Hunting Lane in East Hampton, which is not terribly far from the location of the original Grey Gardens house. Welcome, Carrie.
Thank you.
So, Carrie, for those who have never been to East Hampton Village, take us there. Tell us what it's like and why is it such a specific and particular corner of the East End atmosphere?
East Hampton Village is a place whose residents, particularly older residents and year-round residents, really care about keeping their community quaint and beautiful.
Okay, Carrie, and Hunting Lane, it seems like in East Hampton, every street has a story. What exactly is the story of Hunting Lane? Where did the name come from? Who are the Huntings?
The Huntings are a very old East Hampton family whose roots roots in the area date back to 1696 when Nathaniel Hunting, who then was just 21 and had just graduated from Harvard, came to what was then called the First Church, now the First Presbyterian Church of East Hampton, to assist the local pastor in what was the young town, or the young village rather, of East Hampton. Eventually, actually pretty soon after, he became the pastor himself, a position he'd hold for the next 50 years. The Hunting Inn, which is now where the Palm restaurant is, was actually initially built for the Reverend Nathaniel Hunting and his growing family, and initially was just a 2-story, salt box house. Hunting Lane opened in 1893. Back then, it would have just been a dirt road with horse and buggy, but Hunting Lane was really a place that came to symbolize kind of the wealth that was brought to East Hampton.
So, Carrie, Tyler Hunting is the subject of your piece this week, an older gentleman, a scion of this family. But who was he, and how did you first encounter him?
I grew up spending my summers not far away from Hunting Lane on Amy's Lane in the village of East Hampton. And the first and only time I encountered the resident who is the subject of this piece was when I was in college. I was walking home one morning in the summer from the Jitney, which drops off at the Hunting Inn on Main Street and Hunting Lane. I was walking down Hunting Lane with my college boyfriend, and we stopped sort of stunned at the state of 30 Hunting Lane, this Victorian house that was just completely dilapidated, being eaten by weeds, windows broken, its shingles were falling off. I sort of, being mostly a summer resident, I sort of just assumed it was abandoned because it really looked like this picturesque, sort of grotesque, though, horror movie set. I took a picture only for the resident to, shout at me, call me nosy, and follow me and my boyfriend at the time down the street wielding a rake. He was sort of slow because he was elderly, so he didn't catch up to us. But that was my only run-in with the owner of 30 Hunting Lane, but it was something that definitely stuck with me. But a few weeks ago, or earlier this summer, when I passed by the home again, I saw all of these workmen, sanding it, hammering, doing their thing, and quickly realized, okay, I guess the owner has passed away. I went home and did some digging, curious about what was going on. And it was only then that I found out that the so-called rake man of Hunting Lane was actually himself a member of the Hunting family.
This was a man from a very prominent social background. So how did he end up in this position? And why wasn't the village of East Hampton, or were they actually able to do anything to kind of get that house up to snuff?
From what I understand, Tyler's parents were very much people about town. I found an image of his mother, Hilda Hunting, who eventually became a successful real estate agent, posing with little Edie Beale for a Ladies Village Improvement Society event in 1940. His father chaired dance committees, one for the 300th year celebration of East Hampton. They are in the New York Times Society pages quite a bit. But in terms of how the house fell into this state of disrepair, it's hard to say because unlike his parents, the clues to Tyler's life and who he was are much more sparse. He does appear in a few issues of the East Hampton Star in the 1940s. I know that he was married in 1969 to a woman in San Francisco, that he lived there, that they divorced within just a few years. He moved back to East Hampton maybe sometime in the 90s. His mother was dealing with dementia, and he moved back into the house ostensibly to take care of her. But a lot of neighbors don't really remember a moment when the house became as dilapidated as it was. It sort of, like its owner, began to decay over time.
As you say, it sort of decayed and really became a Grey Gardens-esque kind of monument in the town. But this is where I think your story gets so fascinating because, as you say, he passed away in January. And when you said you walked by it just recently and saw that all of a sudden there's a lot of people sprucing it up, if you're telling us he had no real family, who's got this house now?
Yeah, so to answer your question, Michael, is at some point in the last few years, the village finally got to Tyler Hunting and required him, to do some maintenance in his front yard because it really was a blight on the neighborhood. In response to, I guess, complaints from neighbors and the village's urging, Tyler Hunting allegedly called a local landscaping company, which was owned by a retired volunteer fireman, Tom Strong Sr., and his son, an East Hampton town police officer, Tom Strong Jr. The person who ended up, responding to the call for yard maintenance was the son, Tom Strong Jr., who over the course of a couple years ended up cultivating a sort of unlikely friendship with Mr. Hunting. I think what started as yard work and tree trimming and all that evolved into grocery runs and some social visits. So upon Tyler Hunting's death in January, his will gave everything, his entire estate, to this local police officer who did his yard work. So that's the reason why, this summer, there's been all of this maintenance being done on the house.
Carrie, if this house were to go on the market, do we have a sense of what it would sell for?
As is the estimate I got from a local real estate agent who does not represent, this property, obviously, because it's not for sale. The estimate was $4 million. Online, I've seen something between 2.9 and 3.1. But that really is just for the price of the property, which is really about the location on Hunting Lane in the village of East Hampton.
Well, this is such an interesting story. I mean, Carrie, it just reminds me that the Hamptons, for such a small little corner of the world, it certainly has a disproportionate amount of intrigue.
Definitely. It's all very Grey Gardens.
Okay, Michael, in New York, we get a really bad rap for lavishing money on adolescents, whether that's for bat mitzvahs, quinceañeras, sweet 16 parties, but we are not alone. It turns out in Utah, of all places, the Mormon community has figured out a way to celebrate their teenagers as they open their mission calls. What is a mission call? What is going on in the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City land? Samantha Leach is here to explain. Samantha is an editor at Bustle, and her book, The Alyssas, 3 Girls, One Fate, and the Deadly Secrets of Suburbia, is now out from Legacy Lit. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Samantha, as I was reading your fascinating story on rites of passage among the Mormon population in the U.S., I was struck by how much we've been hearing about the Mormons recently, despite the fact that they represent only 1.2% of the U.S. population. So why do you think they're getting so much attention in the media, first of all?
That's an interesting question. And reading the story, this is unsurprising. My entry point into it is via the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. I wasn't a huge Bravo fan for a long time, but I was assigned 2 years ago now a profile on Lisa Barlow, who is quite a lightning rod within both the Real Housewives community, but the Mormon community, in the fact that she drinks, she's okay with divorce. I mean, she literally is a tequila brand. And I think, seeing someone who's a lot flashier and has this preference for pleasure over quietness was really interesting. Now, I can't say in general that our fascination with Mormons is because of this new hit Bravo show. I think there's a perennial fascination because of the Romneys, but that is what tipped off my renewed interest, as well as my interest in these parties in particular.
And Samantha, the Mormons in Salt Lake City, as you report, have quite a bit of money. I mean, where is this coming from? What businesses and industries are they involved in?
I think it's a mix. I can't say for certain any one industry. Like I mentioned, one woman that I spoke to was a tequila entrepreneur, I think, which again is an exception. In terms of others, I just think Salt Lake and I had the vantage point of speaking to people relating to and via the lens of this housewife show, which is wealthy, it's based in wealthier enclaves. I do think that not it's not across the board that all these Mormons have the ability and the funds at the ready to be throwing such lavish parties, that I do think this article particularly targeted that sect. I think it was more sample of the people I was to.
And tell us a little bit about this missionary component to Mormonism and how it unfurls over the course of an adolescence.
Yeah. So basically, and I've always been really fascinated by the concept of missions to begin with, but when you're 18 years old, young Mormon men, who are referred to at that point as elders, are eligible to apply for a 2-year mission. Sisters, meaning women, are able to at 19, and they're only allowed to serve for 18 months. Learning more about it, it felt a lot like the college application process. You have to get recommendations. I mean, instead of from your teachers, it's from local church leaders. You apply. It kind of reminded me of how back in the day you'd wait for that thick envelope, whereas now you get a text being like, log into the portal. It's funny to see these things become much more modernized. Basically, from there, you don't have any say in where you're going. Some people luck out. And like, I know Colombia lately has been like a really hot spot people have wanted to go to for whatever reason, but you can pretty much end up anywhere across the world and doing a wide range of activities. Another entry point into the story for me is I'm just really fascinated with cultural rites of passage. So I just really love rituals and the parties we throw around them. But yes, the mission, it's celebrating something that is actually a huge, massive undertaking and commitment. And I wanted to underscore that as well. This is not a casual endeavor to go on a mission.
So that being said, let's get into the meat of your story, which is this call opening party. What exactly is this?
It's a bit like a gender reveal meets with a coming of age bent of a bat mitzvah. So when a prospective missionary finds out that they're received the call of where they're going to go, you typically have a sense, because it's on a rolling basis, you'll have a sense of like a week or two before that chances are, based on the timing, that you will be finding out where you're going, which gives parents enough time to, get catering if they want to. There's a lot of like standard things you'll see at a party, be it like a map where everybody puts like pins on where they think their kid is going to go, the missionary is going to go. That because they know this is coming, there's enough time to like prep the pomp and circumstances around it. A lot of times kids these days will put a call out on social media saying mission call on like Instagram story, mission call opening up and happening at my house, and say, let's make it up 7:00. Come by. Because a lot of these kids are all doing and implying around the same time in these Mormon dense communities like Salt Lake, there can be 4+ mission call openings on one night. So you'll go, 100 or so kids will gather. The missionary who the party is in honor of will stand in the middle. He'll read off his letter. Sometimes music will play after. Food will then be served. A lot of well wishes, people being like, oh, I know someone who went to Santiago, you should connect with them. Occasionally there's food trucks, sometimes, music. It really depends. They're not there super long because, again, you're basically making like deals with your friends because you want to be able to celebrate everyone equally. So it's like, okay, well, you can have 7 to 7:45. I'm going to do 7:45 to 8:30. So then these kids, depending on the distance between the mission call openings, they start doing like where they either will like sprint to the next house or caravan in a car. So there's a lot of movement and party jumping, which I think is really fun for them.
Isn't this sort of opulent display of wealth kind of antithetical to the missionary movement behind all of this?
Yeah. And I think that tension is what really interested me. Our perceptions of the Mormon community, and I believe on the whole, are accurately like these are people who don't drink coffee or alcohol. I know that their stances toward LGBTQ rights have become more, I wouldn't say lax, but less highly condemning in recent years. So yes, it is surprising to see these displays of opulence and wealth. I spoke to a lot of people involved. And again, some people do not throw parties like this. Some people are more modest. So a lot of the women that I spoke to, mothers, the missionaries, they still don't drink alcohol. They are still practicing other elements of the piousness. But when it comes to these parties themselves, they talk a lot about the social media pressure and the fact that, I think it's something we feel. I mean, I believe it's why gender reveals have become what they are. I think that like social media keeping up with the Joneses' desire has not skipped the Mormon community either.
And how, given all the attention that the Mormon community is receiving on social media in particular, it seems like we can't get enough of these influencers. Is there a bit of a backlash against this at all?
I haven't seen a backlash against this. I think when I went into the story, I thought they were called, what did I think it was called? Like a Mormon mission reveal. And then I learned it was a mission call opening. I just don't think this has been particularly covered yet. I can very much imagine a world where thered be more of a backlash. It does stand at odds a little bit with what we're seeing. And I am curious about what the response to this story will be for that reason.
So Samantha, like the sort of center of the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City is this woman, Lisa Barlow. And as you kind of note in your story, when it came to planning the mission party for her son, Jack, she knew what she wanted to focus on, as you say in the story. Her favorite Italian cookies, which were flown in from New York City, and caprese popsicles and a charcuterie board. Who is she and how does the community there view her?
To go deeper on the housewives, so there's one faction on Real Housewives of Salt Lake City of women who have defected from the church. Most famously is this woman, Heather Gay. She had a best-selling book out last year called Bad Mormon. She was a missionary. She lived her life to a T by the Book of Mormon, everything. And she had a come to Jesus, or whatever you want to call it, where she was like, I do not support this. So for her, this idea that Lisa can find this happy middle ground where she can drink tequila and throw lavish parties, but still say, no, like, I love God and God is okay with me wearing flashy outfits is really tough. And it kind of is a really interesting microcosm within the Housewives franchise that speaks to a tension I imagine is very present within these communities, is that, in our modern times, these are very traditionalist values that I think increasingly people are beginning to question and having a lack of desire to follow, but it is their scripture. So that is a very present part of it. And I think does make Lisa both a compelling and polarizing figure.
Well, thanks so much, Samantha. What an interesting universe you have reported on. I have a feeling we're going to be talking more about this as the attention only grows.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. AML's Arts Intel Report, our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it, is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at ml.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at ml.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, ML Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
It is the weekend, Michael. I know you have something perhaps you can recommend to us.
I do. I've got, a couple of weeks ago, I recommended the great documentary on Faye Dunaway. And there's a new sort of one about another completely compelling leading lady, and that's Elizabeth Taylor. It's called Elizabeth Taylor, The Lost Tapes, but it could have really, I think, been called Taylor, The Lost Era. This is on Max, and it takes these tapes that were found recently in the archive of a late journalist, and they're 40 hours of interviews that he did with her as part of a research for a book. And they started in 1964 when she's 32, at the peak of her fame and her beauty, and she's got that amazing, wonderful, alluring voice, and it sort of does these interviews over the years. You get the whole sweep of her career, talking about, everyone from Roddy McDowell to James Dean to Montgomery Clift. But it's totally compelling, as I said, and you get some lost footage. It's not the last word on her, but it's a sort of a look into her life that you would not really see much before. It's called Elizabeth Taylor, The Lost Tapes, and it is on Max. And you, my dear?
Well, I'm having a very adolescent moment, I guess, in this episode, but have you seen the new movie Twisters?
No, I haven't. Did you see it in a theater with a big bucket of popcorn?
You know me, Michael. Look, I'm from Kansas, so this was a big movie when the original came out in 1996, that's starring Helen Hunt as a storm chaser, but now we have a remake starring Glenn Powell and Daisy Edgar Jones. It is a bit of a love story among storm chasers and aspiring scientists from Oklahoma, but it is kind of a fun summer movie, and I definitely am not hating on it. It's got everything you want. Although, I have to say, I'm a little bummed because last summer we had Barbie, we had Oppenheimer. I mean, it was really a moment and an excuse to get to the theater. And I feel like this summer has fallen a bit short for me.
Were you scared at all?
I was not very scared, no. But, I'm from Kansas. So we don't find storms that terrifying in general, no matter how bad they can be.
Okay, Dorothy.
Well, we thank you all so much for joining us. We wish you a wonderful weekend full of romance, comedy, and everything in between. Michael, will you please read us out?
The Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. And our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collect Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.